Welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast. We're your source for personal, professional, and organizational growth and development, where we share original research, explore industry trends, and interview executives and thought leaders from across the globe. We hope you join us often for practitioner-oriented content around all things related to leadership, HR, talent management, organizational development, and change management. Maximize your personal and organizational potential with Human Capital Innovations Podcast. Welcome to the Human Capital Leadership Podcast. In this HCL podcast episode, I talk with Eric Thomas and Bridgette McAdoo about how to demystify corporate social activism. Eric and Bridgette, welcome to the conversation today.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it.
It's a pleasure to have you. You're joining me from different parts of the country, I believe. Eric, you're joining me from Texas. Bridgette, where are you at?
In the DC area.
In the DC area. Wonderful. And I'm south of Salt Lake City in Utah. So we're representing different parts of the country. And I think it's pretty hot and warm where all of us are located right now, but hopefully we'll have nice fall weather here soon. Today, we're going to be talking about demystifying corporate social activism. And I'm really, really thrilled to have both of these wonderful guests here with me today to have this conversation. As we get started, I just wanted to share briefly a little bit about Eric and Bridgette. Eric Thomas leads the DE&I practice at Genesys. He is charged with developing global programs that deliver progressive diversity and foster an inclusive culture throughout the company. And Bridgette McAdoo is the VP and Chief Sustainability Officer at Genesys. She is responsible for sustainability as a management approach that holistically optimizes Genesys's economic, social, and environmental impact. And I could say a lot more about both of you, but I'm going to pause there, refer people to the show notes for a more thorough background, and give both of you a chance to say a little bit more about your background and personal context, and then we'll just dive on into the conversation.
I am our first Chief Sustainability Officer, coming on the heels of Eric being our first Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer. It gave me the opportunity to kind of come in and look at how can we continue to build momentum off of all of the commitments and the values that we have at Genesys. So we started our journey really in January 2021 of driving sustainability and making it just part of our organic DNA at Genesys. And over the past 2.5, almost 3 years, I think we've done a fantastic job of really inoculating it within our culture. And we've seen it through, we're very transparent about the goals that we set and making sure that we measure those goals. So especially even if I just talk about it from an environmental perspective, having year-on-year reductions in our emissions and putting together foundational strengths with our policies, having great engagement with our employees and our ambassadors globally, and then collectively collaborating consistently with Eric's team on making as they drive DE&I across the organization. So I'll pass it over to Eric, and he can talk about all the great momentum and strides that we've made through our diversity initiatives.
Yeah, thanks, Bridgette. So as Bridgette mentioned, I also have the privilege of serving as Genesys' first Chief Diversity Officer. We started our journey in July of 2020, so we just kind of hit that 3-year mark. And it has mostly been about how do we embed the concepts of inclusion at its core into the DNA of how we operate as a company? And that looks into just about every practice, every procedure, and to some degree, several policy. How do we make sure it is embedded and built in a very sustainable way that outlives me and even Tony, our CEO, and that was kind of part of the conversation when we started. And, over the past 3 years, I'd say it has been quite the journey. We've seen our workforce really, really embrace a number of the different concepts that we rolled out. One of them being, reaching parity with the representation of workforce to align with the markets in which we operate and serve. We focus on, gender equality around the globe, and we lean in on various race and ethnic groups in the U.S. And if anyone's interested, you can look at the recent sustainability report that we published this past year. I think it was back in June, that shares progress over those 3 years and really speaks to, I would say, the level of commitment that Genesys has demonstrated at really bringing DEI to the forefront.
Well, thank you both for that background, and it's really interesting. So I'm curious. You mentioned July of 2020. That's the middle of the pandemic. That's the middle of, like, we're in the George Floyd moment. There's a lot of social and political upheaval at that time, not to mention the pandemic and vaccines and masking and all the debates around all of that. That was a challenging time for everyone, I think. And organizations were trying to figure out how they were going to respond to all of the broader social environment around them. Was that part of what drove the establishment of your areas at that time 3 years ago?
I would say absolutely yes. I will say that, I had a number of conversations with Tony Bates, our CEO, when I was approached about this role, because I did a pivot. I was leading a global professional services team, and I really had been working and cultivating a career over the past 2 decades as an IT consultant. So I'm not a traditional or seasoned diversity practitioner, but I was approached at that time by Tony as, I guess you would say, as it was articulated to me, as a trusted leader in the company who could help us pivot with something very important to him. And even though admittedly the aftermath of that and the tragic murder of George Floyd served as the catalyst for us jumpstarting our diversity efforts, I believe it was always part of Tony's agenda to have a diversity office. He was less than a year and a half into his post as CEO. And I think those efforts just accelerated this work as a priority for him and for our company. I'll also say that with everything that you outlined that was happening during that period, COVID, the aftermath of the George Floyd murder, everything that we were experiencing in the summer and the fall of 2020, I think it served as a litmus test for Genesys. And it really created the opportunity for us to truly define what are our cultural values, where do we stand in the midst of these types of scenarios, and how they intersect with our business objectives. And I think what we saw was a set of values that emerged with empathy as the cornerstone that led to not just the work that we're doing on the diversity front, but as Bridgette alluded to earlier, bringing Bridgette in and building out our sustainability efforts as well.
We've seen over the past year, if you compare 2020 and 2021 to today, and how diversity and sustainability is being led, I still feel that we are just as committed today as we were 2 and 3 years ago. And that is something that you don't see in some companies. They're starting to revert a little bit. And so, to Eric's point, I think it was always part of Tony's true desire for how the business was going to pivot under his leadership. So this wasn't just a response. It was actually, just that catalyst to get to where we are today.
Yeah. And I like the framing around catalyzing, because I think that was the case for many organizations. Organizations I've been involved with for a long time were in the same boat. Like, these were important values to them. They're things that they talked about, that they trained on, that they put time and energy towards. But it was just like this moment where all these different things were converging all at the same time. And it just kind of pushed people to kind of either like stand up and do something, say something, beyond performative measures, but like to actually do something, or to show their true colors, and perhaps be an organization that people weren't as happy to be a part of during that time. And so I think it definitely, that period of time was a catalyst. And over the last 3 years, of course, we've seen so much continual kind of change and upheaval, and it's no easier today than it was then, right? And I did want to ask about that performative element, because you both kind of referred to it a little bit. There's lots of organizations that say the right things. They put out a press statement, when something happens, but do they really bring this into how they run the company, their core values, the policies, practices, and procedures that create the environment in which people come to work and how they do the work that they do. Tell us a little bit more about Genesys and how you got beyond the performative aspects. It's important, to signal and to demonstrate support, in a variety of ways, but getting beyond the signaling, how do you get into actually doing the work?
Sure, it's a very fair question, especially now as we're starting to see regression in some places and some companies. I think the reason why we're continuing to see momentum at Genesys is because we wanted to ensure that this was extremely intentional and authentic to us. So as we wanted, if we thought about our environmental journey, we wanted to make those goals. We want to be transparent about those goals, even as a privately held company, right? You don't see a lot of privately held companies come out like the way we have. We wanted to report. And, the minute we put out our first sustainability report with goals and a baseline for not just environment, but for diversity, that was something you didn't see most companies do, especially privately held companies of our size or any size. So there was always this intentionality that we have put towards it. And we're extremely, I have PTSD when it comes to sustainability language. I'm extremely careful. I want us to make sure that we, if we're going to make a statement, that we feel absolutely confident that we can stand by it any day or at any time. So we do not say things we don't mean. And we put our efforts forward in places and in spaces that we know we can truly execute on. So I think the intentionality and the commitment that we have across our leadership team is what helps us to stay out of that performative and to really be an intentional change that we're driving.
Yeah, I think I would probably only add, you to the getting at the center of your question of what do we do differently. I mean, when I look at both of our sustainability and our diversity aspirations, we, not only that we make them public, we also report out on them as part of our key corporate dashboard initiative. So metrics that we track along with financial growth, EBITDA, ARR, and other key financial growth, we also track against our sustainability goals and our diversity aspirations, and we report out to our board. We report them out publicly, and we report them out to all of our employees. So there's a level of transparency there that I think inherently drives a level of accountability as well.
Yeah, and to Eric's point, those strategic business KPIs that now sustainability and diversity sit within makes it not just our job. Right. Everyone across Genesys has the same responsibility to help us meet those metrics. And that is part of that's truly how you get out of performative, is when you operationalize those guys. And now everyone across the business is just as responsible. We just happen to lead this great piece of work, but it's truly everyone's job.
Yeah. And I do want to say, I do recognize that everyone needs to start somewhere. And so I do think when I say performative, I do think there are many leaders, many organizations that have very good intentions. And they want to do well. They want to get into the space. They're not really sure how to do it. And so what they're doing probably will come off as performative. As long as they recognize there are steps towards growth and development in this area, and putting out a press release in and of itself doesn't mean a whole lot of anything. It's a signal, but if you follow that up then with continued conversations and systematizing things like you were just mentioning, that's where you start to get to the real impact. And so for anyone listening who's thinking, I really want to do this, I don't really know how to do this. It's sometimes people consider it kind of a minefield, and I'm worried about, stepping in a place that's not safe and etc. Just come as you are, come where you're at, start trying, talk to people, and develop over time. And I think we can all get to a place of improvement in fairly short order if we're committed to getting beyond the performative elements. So anyways, I just wanted to mention that because I do know there are people with good intentions that want to do more, and I don't want to discourage them from starting somewhere.
Absolutely.
I think I would go ahead.
I'll just say one quick thing. I will say that being in sustainability for over 10 years, a lot of this work does usually come as a groundswell. It's, a passion of employees and they're trying to roll it uphill. But where truly, I think, has the greatest success for those who are trying to figure out what's next. If it's not a top-down approach, you just really don't get the benefit to the business. We are very lucky and blessed that we have a CEO who is committed and a TLT who is committed to the initiatives just as much as we are, or a leadership team. When you don't have that, and many don't, we talk to our colleagues all the time and they don't have the support, the alignment, or the authority to go and truly drive the change. And that's where it becomes extremely difficult, and it can make people lose their fire for it, because you feel like you're constantly running uphill against bulldozers coming down at you. And so
that's a good way to describe it. I've often said it just feels like you're like pounding your head against a brick wall, sometimes. Running uphill and a bulldozer is trying to plow you down. That's a great way to frame it. It can be very challenging, even in the best of circumstances where you have top-down support. It's still challenging work, and so let's try to take away the barriers to the extent possible, so that we don't burn people out, so that people can feel empowered to drive these changes.
I would say part of what makes that the challenge, right, is the consistent shifting of the landscape of the environment. When we started this work 3 years ago, as Bridgette mentioned, there was a lot of groundswell of enthusiasm that you could see across the industry. And it awakened what I called organized opposition. And now the organized opposition understands the momentum that was building, particularly around the DE&I space. And now you're seeing things shift. You're seeing decisions like the Roe v. Wade being overturned, and the latest decision around affirmative action. And I think for me, what I've witnessed, just having these conversations with my peers in the industry, other chief diversity officers, and how they're navigating some of this, I think the difference maker between performative and sustainable work is really rooted in your values. What are your corporate values, and what do you stand for? Because anytime there's a question as to whether we lean in here or we don't, is there a question, do we get behind this one particular issue, or do we hold steady here when the wind is shifting us in one direction or the next? I always challenge our leadership to go back to our corporate values. What did we say we wanted to be and who we are? And that helps you with really sifting through a lot of the nuances that surface as a result of changes in the tide. And I think a lot of companies, at least some of the ones I've witnessed, where CDOs have left their posts after a couple of years, and talking to them personally about their challenges, the company wasn't clear on their corporate values. And it was easy to shift with the change in the wind.
Yeah, it certainly continues to be messy. You just think about the social and political landscape and how things have changed in the past 3 years. This isn't a political podcast, so we're not going to get into all of that today, but it does add a level of complexity to what you're trying to do in your organizations, frankly, where you're located, and where you're trying to do this work, right? Now, I at the very beginning, on the outset, I talked about demystifying corporate social activism. Of course, we've been talking about that the whole time, but I think it would be worth taking a moment to just really define that. What do you mean by that? How do we go about demystifying corporate social activism? We've been talking about how organizations can get involved in social activism. Why is this mystifying, and how can we demystify it?
Yeah, I think I'll respond by kind of reacting a bit to what you said about. I understand that there's the intent of this conversation was not to get into politics, but I think regardless of what your politics are, as these various social events occur, you still have to lean in on what your values are and what's going to fuel you. And I'll tell you, for example, at Genesys, we've taken probably more of a socially activist approach than most. You can look back through various public statements around different events that have happened from January 6th to I mentioned Roe v. Wade, even to the affirmative action decision. Not once did we take a political position, either one, the approach we took, it was around human rights and the impact that it has on individuals as a human to be able to live in safe spaces and to be able to operate in a way where they feel like their civil liberties are not at risk. And it doesn't matter whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. It's a matter of looking at it through a human equity eyes, right? And that's the approach that we've taken at Genesys, because it's not, to me, it's not about politics. It's not about taking a political stance. It's about understanding what your values are, and as a result, letting that determine your social activism.
Yeah, and I think to that point, the reason why I feel like we kind of demystified it. So through Eric's team, we have these inclusion groups globally. And in addition to inclusion groups, out of those inclusion groups, we have given and empowered our employees to truly speak through a voice and through a lens that is specific to them. They get to curate those conversations too. Eric and his team make sure not to tell them what to say. They come up with different conversations. So they will have and put together empathy hours to address any of these topics that might come up or there's a need to talk about. And the fact that they have this space to do that is so important. We've had so many employees say, I've never been someplace where I could even have this conversation. Mm-hmm. It could be just as simple as adoption or being of different ethnicities and growing up in a different household. Or, there were so many conversations we've had since I've been here over the past 3 years that even, over 2 decades, being in this corporate world, I've just been amazed that we've been as vulnerable as we have been to allow our employees this space and a place to really have the empathy they need. And to, and because of that, I think that in itself demystifies any type of ability to be, their social activism is innate to them. They get to express it how they want to. Now, luckily, they usually and mostly are extremely conscious of making sure they don't violate others in the process. But, we don't try to, I haven't seen them, to be censored. It's just been a very open and vulnerable space. And over the past 3 years of all of our groups, really creating those opportunities.
Well, one other quick note I'll share, John, in terms of our approach at demystifying social activism is, there was a mechanism that we put into place early on, which was basically a decision rubric that looks at when certain events happen around the globe, it allows us to do a self-check to determine whether or not this is something we have credibility against to engage in. Do we make a statement? Do we remain silent? Do we go beyond a statement and maybe it has an impact on some of our benefits or how we engage with our employees? And it's basically a pretty clear rubric that we go through a quick check and things like, what have we spoken out on something like this before? What could be the impact to our employees? What could be the impact to our customers? Reputational risk and these types of things. And we put that mechanism in place. Bridgette participates in some of those conversations. Sometimes it's the head of HR with comms, and depending on the severity of the scenario, Tony himself may weigh in. And we use that as a way of kind of guiding ourselves through these different social events as they surface. And it's been one of the key ways in which we at Genesys have worked to demystify social activism.
Yeah, and I mean, I think everyone knows, when Dr. Martin Luther King, when he talked about, silence is just as, as a form of complicity. And we have realized that, being silent doesn't give our employees the support they need. So whether it's us just having simple things, even if it's not a statement, right? So to Eric's point, it might not be a statement, it might be an empathy hour that needs to take place for employees. And, when Buffalo happened, just this recent event in Jacksonville, we want to make sure that our employees know that there is space for them to speak. We don't know what
it's a process.
It's a process.
Yeah. And I love how you've systematized this. I love having a values-based rubric to look at these different types of events. Or different conditions that are occurring, the different approaches that you take within the organization, in large part depending on what the event is, but also the needs of your people, and ultimately just providing a safe space for them to come and be genuine, authentic, and vulnerable with each other and to share. It takes a lot of trust to create that kind of a space. And my suspicion is that didn't happen overnight. Like, it takes work to develop that kind of trust, but it's very powerful when you have it. And so, yeah, I hope that we don't have to devolve into like partisan politics with people, just feeling so strongly in one camp or the other that they can't come together and have these human conversations around these challenging issues. It doesn't need to be that way. Like, we can just be there as human beings with each other, listening to each other, trying to understand each other, and understanding what's happening and how things are impacting each other. That goes a really long way, regardless of where you might lean in terms of politics or partisan politics or whatever. Well, this has just been a really great conversation. We've only scratched the surface. There's so much more we could talk about, but I know at the time, and I need to let you go here in just a minute. So before we wrap things up for today, I just wanted to give you a chance to share with the audience how they can connect with you and find out more about your work, and then give us a final word on the topic for today.
Sure. So you can find me on LinkedIn, Bridgette McAdoo, but please do visit our sustainability website. So it's genesys.com/sustainability. And you can find our report, all the great things we're doing. It'll also take you to our DE&I page, where you can find all of our great things that are happening across our inclusion groups and our diversity teams. And I think my final thing would be, especially for leaders out there, is just to make sure that you are rooted in your values, both personally and professionally, and that the leadership is committed to them.
Yeah, I would echo that. I mean, you can find me on LinkedIn at Eric Thomas, not the motivational speaker, but the other Eric Thomas. And I think in terms of just leading with empathy, and being committed to embedding inclusion into the structure of how you do things. It's not about increasing representation of women or Black folk. It's about making sure that as a company, how you do things and your policies and your practices, that you're thinking with the most marginalized groups in mind, and you build from there.
I love it. Eric and Bridgette, it has just been a real pleasure. I encourage the audience to reach out, get connected, find out more about what Eric and Bridgette can do for you, about Genesys and the cool things that they're doing there. And as always, I hope everyone can stay healthy and safe, that you can find meaning and purpose at work each and every day. And I hope you all have a great week. Thanks again for joining us for this episode of the Human Capital Innovations Podcast. I hope you stay healthy and safe, and that you have a great week.